Nobody that knows about Oreimo is going to disagree if I say that it isn't the greatest anime. Sure, when it released, it was among a select few anime that discussed the fans of the medium itself. However, unlike the cultural touchstone of Lucky Star or Welcome to the NHK's insight into escapism, Oreimo focused more on the societal implications of its time. Back then, anime wasn't accepted as a normal hobby anywhere, and just saying that you watched one episode of that one magical girl cartoon was sometimes all that was needed to warrant getting the air knocked out of you behind the school playground. Unfortunately, with the advent of streaming and the medium becoming more generally accepted, that aspect of Oreimo aged about as well as my appreciation for card game anime. Most of its appeal is purely from nostalgia, and as the next generation of fans discover it, it only becomes more apparent that they don't really care for how things used to be. Ufotable is now known for Demon Slayer instead of Fate, Kyoto Animation for Violet Evergarden rather than Haruhi, Studio Wit for Ranking of Kings rather than Attack on Titan. Heck, even the basic concept of fantasy has been all but reformed to be one and the same as isekai, although that's probably isekai's fault for not being able to be anything other than fantasy. Nevertheless, time continues to pass, and it only becomes more clear that interest for even somewhat visually modern anime has faded away. Hazel and Kenny Launderdale are just two YouTubers that focus extensively on the retro arena of anime, but it makes me wonder how much time is left before somebody inevitably asks the question,
does anybody remember when Black Lagoon was airing?
Only to be met with confused stares and an awkward silence. Oreimo isn't that old, of course, but it's not like it ever had massive staying power to begin with. Ever since the series finished airing in 2013, it's been getting harder to recommend given its, well, to put it lightly, controversial ending. Add in the release of Eromanga Sensei by the same author in 2017, and recommending the series seems laughable. With that said, I still decided to watch it, if only to sate my curiosity and to answer one question. How good was it? Obviously I didn't think it was very good, but I can't just say that and leave now, can I? No, like my microbiology professor, I can't just tell you what histoplasm capsulatum looks like, I have to show you, and for that I'm going to need an intense focus on detail. Move over, Amelia Watson, your modified monocle and magnifying glass won't be enough for today's investigations. I'm going to need something. You know, I think the Hubble Space Telescope would do quite nicely. There we go, now just zoom in a little and, great, I can't see anything. Fine, pass me the monocle. To imagine I wasted all of that money just stealing a satellite. Now, where was I? Right. Welcome to Labra Stories. In the modern day, I believe the commonly accepted term is weeb, but for the purposes of this video, I'll be using otaku. I'm doing so because it's the term used in Oreimo, and I will be using it strictly within the confines of that context. You all good with that? Good. Now, without further ado, Oreimo is a disaster. Oreimo begins with Kyosuke Kosaka, who wants nothing more than to be a normal person, to be mundane, blend in with society, and to avoid conflict so that he can live peacefully. In this regard, Monami Tamura is the perfect girl for him, but she's also his childhood friend, so by the laws of anime, they can never end up together. At the moment, Kyosuke's life is ideal, but not for long. After accidentally bumping into his sister, he discovers a DVD case for the anime Stardust Witch Merudu that contains an R18 eroge. He found the case in plain sight, so it must have fallen from Kirino's bag during the fall, but that begs the question, why did Kirino have this in her bag in the first place? Kirino doesn't have any friends that would be interested in it, and in fact she's actually scared of what might happen if her friends did find out she was an otaku. So Kirino doesn't have a reason to be carrying around an anime, and as such it either ended up in her bag by accident or that she had some alternative reason and planted it for Kyosuke to discover. And that latter explanation doesn't make a lot of sense because their collision was purely a coincidence. Nevertheless, Kyosuke finds himself on the verge of becoming a pickle. Given how straight-laced his parents are, it would be a disaster if they found the game, and he isn't entirely convinced that it belongs to his sister either, so just to make sure, he asks about the anime at the dinner table. His parents of course tell him to stay away from otaku culture, but Kirino is obviously disturbed, an expected result from somebody who's just discovered that they've misplaced an eroge, which is a point for the bag theory. However, Oreimo never confirms it either. The DVD case isn't on the floor when Kyosuke enters the house, it is never shown to be in Kirino's bag, nor does it fall out of Kirino's bag. It just appears on the floor.
Lab, that's just an animation error. You don't have to be so harsh on the show.
Yes, it is. Now shut up. It's important for later. Kirino excuses herself and is later found raiding Kyosuke's room. Her search is unsuccessful because Kyosuke of course has the case on his body, but now that they're in private, he gives it back to her. He says it's not his and it's not hers. As far as Kyosuke is concerned, the case doesn't exist, nor did it ever exist, extricating himself from the situation. Kirino, however, has other plans, waking him up in the middle of the night and bringing him to her room. There she reveals that she avidly collects Siscon eroge, as well as the fact that she is a freak. I mean, how many people only watch one anime? Other than Dragon Ball fans. Additionally, it's weird that Kirino would even enjoy Siscon eroge, and when asked why, she says she doesn't know. She just thinks it's neat. Now, Kyosuke already tried to get out of this, but he isn't insane, so to appease his sister, he tells her that he will help her keep her secret, even if he doesn't have any clue of how he would even begin to do that. Kirino, on the other hand, does, and so she forces him to play one of her eroge. Not that that actually has anything to do with Kyosuke keeping her secret, but nevertheless, Kyosuke agrees to play along. He doesn't make much progress though. He didn't even know that eroge existed until recently. He doesn't own anything more sophisticated than a flip phone, and he doesn't want to play a Syscon-oriented eroge. Fortunately, Monami gives him some advice, and with the help of her insight, Kyosuke decides that in all likelihood, Kirino just needs some otaku friends. And what better way to find some than an IRL meetup via SNS, the Japanese term for social media. Kirino, of course, knows about SNS, which makes sense given that her collection suggests a significant amount of time on the internet, but what doesn't make sense is that she hasn't used it. Sure, she could be anxious to meet people she doesn't know, but that argument doesn't hold any water. Kirino is an honor student, well known for her high performance on the school's track team and a model for a teens fashion magazine. Something about all of that just doesn't add up to making me inclined to believe that she's socially anxious. Kirino does eventually submit a request to join the Otaku Girls Unite meetup and receives an acceptance response in less than 10 seconds from the group's moderator Sayori Makashima. That is probably just a pacing error, but I don't want to discount the idea that Sayori knew this would be coming either. A few days pass and Kirino drags Kyosuke out to Akiba with the excuse that she would be embarrassed to meet the other members by herself. I have noted the error with that, but there is another issue here. Kirino hates Kyosuke. She never even calls him by his name, instead defaulting to you and Baka, tells him not to touch her, insults him constantly, and for several years before the story began acted as if he didn't exist. So then why is she suddenly trying to get his attention? Good question, I'll have to answer that later. Eventually, Kirino does become friends with two of the attendees, Sayori and Kuroneko. Sayori acts as the mediator of the group, keeping tensions down and catering to the interests of the other two as needed, which is needed very much because Kuroneko doesn't seem to like Kirino too much. From the beginning, the two spend most of their time fighting over their taste in anime, but they stick together because they don't have anyone else to talk to. But at the very least, Kirino has friends now, and Kyosuke has completed the eroge. He sits outside with Monami and rejoices that he can finally return to his normal life. That is until he returns home to find his dad staring down Kirino over an eroge. The mom says she isn't sure what happened, but that it seems like Kirino had bumped into the dad when she returned home and dropped the eroge. It sounds just like the run-in with Kyosuke, but Kirino was just an Akiba and bought an eroge, so at least it makes sense that it was on her this time. Except for one small detail. It's the same exact Stardust Witch Meru DVD case.
Coincidence? I think not!
Kirino just came back from Akihabara, so for any eroge to have been in the case, she would have had to bring it with her, which can only mean one thing. This was premeditated. Kirino intentionally dropped the eroge in front of the dad, and everything that Kirino has done, and maybe everything she will do, has been premeditated to achieve a goal. As for why or what that goal is, no definitive answer will be available for 28 episodes. The next thing Kyosuke knows, Kirino has run out of the house, and at his mother's orders he gives chase. Once reunited, Kirino informs Kyosuke of what their father had said, that being that he takes the news about otaku culture with a grain of salt. He doesn't necessarily think it's repulsive just because of the way it is, but because of the way society views it. If you're outed as an otaku, then Japan as a whole will reject you, and because of this, the dad sees no long-term benefit to the hobby. Kirino finishes the retelling, and Kyosuke tells her that she has two choices. She can stop or fight. Kyosuke is all for Kirino giving up her hobby because then he could go back to having a peaceful life. Kirino, however, chooses to fight. Both her outwards upstanding citizen persona and her indulgences in eroge have become wholly part of who she views herself to be. It's not so much that she doesn't want to stop, but that she doesn't think she even can anymore. With that, Kyosuke has a choice to make. He can stand on the sidelines doing nothing as he watches his sister fight, resulting in the direct breakdown of his home life, or he can help in some way to orchestrate and compromise. When put in that light, it doesn't seem like he has much of a choice when the former would require him to change a large portion of his worldview, and it's not like that's gonna happen without warning. Kyosuke returns home and begins by pouring out a pile of Kirino's school supplies. His point in doing so is to illustrate that despite her hobby, she's still doing well in school in order to demonstrate that her hobby has not been degenerative. But the dad had already admitted that he wasn't so concerned that the hobby was affecting her now, and rather how it would affect her later, so this point doesn't really seem relevant. Kyosuke also brings up Kirino's friends, showing that the hobby's led to some benefit, which is a solid point, and then transitions the argument to comparing her hobby to her job as a model. The dad says he's fine with Kirino buying fancy clothes and being a model because it's part of their agreement, but there's a problem with this. This statement is irrelevant to the problem at hand. The dad wants to stop Kirino from becoming an otaku so that when she becomes an adult, she isn't an outcast. That is the basis of this argument. Being a model, on the other hand, is a societal label that if anything would propel you to celebrity status, which has an entirely entirely different set of problems than being generally shamed by everyone that knows you. Kyosuke's argument is that Kirino's hobbies are benefiting her now, but he never applies it to the initial problem that needed to be solved. Instead, his final argument is that Kirino has made friends through her hobby, except now with more yelling, and somehow that convinces the dad to let Kirino keep her hobby with no strings attached. This scene infuriates me. It introduces a really important question, but then since it can't answer that question, it completely derails the narrative to ignore it. Of course, such a massive question can't be answered and much less explored deeply in just 3 episodes, making it a theme of the show. Or at least, it should be a theme, but Oreimo continuously mistreats and ignores it for the entirety of its runtime. And with that, the arc concludes with Kyosuke declaring that the eroge belong to him. His hope in doing so is to keep the dad from discovering just how much eroge Kirino has, because that would of course defeat everything that Kyosuke had just accomplished, and luckily for him it works, because it's okay for an underage boy to have eroge but not an underage girl. This is not the gender equality that Kazuma wanted. A month passes, and Kyosuke is playing another of Kirino's games, although rather than eroge, the fighting game Siskali. The appeal to Kirino is obvious, and besides that, Kirino has invited friends over, introducing the audience to Kanako Kurusu and Ayase Aragaki. Kanako's entire character arc is that she hates otakus and so she became an idol, and no, there's no explanation for why that happens, it just does. Ayase, however, is a more robust character. She also has a great dislike for otaku culture and its members, but more importantly, she considers herself to be the best friend of Kirino, although it might be more appropriate to say that she idolizes Kirino, but more on that later, because it's August and that means summer Comiket. During the event, Kirino finds the game that she wanted, but as they only attend to the last day of the convention, just 1 copy remains. In order to get it, they must beat a staff member in the previously shown fighting game. Kirino and Sayori have been shown to have some experience in the game, but they inevitably failed to win, which makes sense given that the staff member is on a 50-game win streak extending over the course of the last 3 days, as well as being a high-ranked competitor for the PC version. What doesn't make sense is that Kuroneko then wins without breaking a sweat. There was no indication that Kuroneko ever touched a video game, and given her disposition against Moe, she should have stayed far away from this one in particular. But apparently she's a gamer, and so she gets the game and gives it to Kirino. Inevitably, the convention comes to an end, and while leaving, they happen to run into Ayase. Not wanting Ayase to find out what she was doing, Kirino leans on Kyosuke to come up with some sort of excuse. By the way, did I mention that Kyosuke attended the convention as well? Anyways, it doesn't take long for Ayase to uncover the truth, quickly revoking their friendship and instructing Kirino to never talk to her again. Understandably, this puts Kirino in a terrible mood, and as the first day of school ends, she glooms on the couch. Seeing this, Kyosuke steps in to help her out, but why? I've glossed over the supporting cast's irregularities, but I can't do that for Kyosuke. Why is he suddenly trying to help Kirino? Why did he attend Comiket? Why is he playing another of Kirino's games? In part 1, he had a valid, consistent reason for doing so, but now that Kirino is gone and shown the entire family her secret, that reason is gone. Sure, Kirino could be pestering him until he submits, but that isn't shown. In fact, there's a lot about Kyosuke that isn't shown. What does he like? What does he excel at in school? What does he do with his friends in free time? Sure, for someone that wants to be mundane, I'm not expecting much, but there's just nothing. Instead, Kyosuke is with his sister, who he hates, going to conventions for activities that, as far as I can tell, he doesn't enjoy, and now he's suddenly trying to cheer up his sister?
Why?
Sure, he may be trying to make his home life calmer and avoid constant pestering from Kirino, but then why not show that? Furthermore, he doesn't have to attend Comiket either, and it seems like he only does so because he has nothing else to do with his life. And because of this, his behavior is becoming unpredictable. He isn't acting on reason anymore so much as he is just for the convenience of a plot, and that makes him feel just a bit contrived. Although I don't want to conclude that quite yet, it is only episode 5. Nevertheless, it doesn't help that Kirino then tells him to solve her falling out with Ayase, a request that he accepts. It doesn't take long for Kyosuke to discover that earlier that day, Ayase had tried to get back together with Kirino by telling her to simply drop her otaku hobby. Her intent in doing so was twofold. The first reason is Ayase's disgust for otakus, especially those with interests like Kirino's. The second reason is that she's worried Kirino likes anime more than her. The support for that being her borderline irrational hatred of lies, and since Kirino lied to cover up her hobby, she must like it more than Ayase. Obviously, with logic like that, all it takes to have that resolved is for Kirino to tell Ayase that she's allowed to have interests that aren't mutual with her friends, and that doing so won't get in the way of their friendship. But that doesn't resolve the first problem, and Ayase won't let herself be with Kirino until it's removed. Kirino can't think of a way to do so, so she glares at Kyosuke, who then declares that he and Kirino have been collecting tales of forbidden love, given the implication that Kirino was being forced to play along. Ayase swallows this hook, line, and sinker, quickly running away with Kirino and sending a text to Kyosuke. She thanks him for his help in getting them to make up, even though that had nothing to do with him in the first place, but if he defiles Kirino, she will kill him. An exaggeration to be sure, but that doesn't mean he's in the clear either. His cover story is very flimsy, so it may only be a matter of time before Ayase finds out that Kirino actually does like such deplorable content. But that is a storm for another day. Kirino has written a light novel titled My Star, and according to Kuroneko, it's not very good. The novel is terribly formatted, having pages left half empty for no apparent reason, my immortal-style self-insert soliloquies, and a pervasive use of emoticons. All this to say nothing of the writing quality of the story itself, but given that the story consisted of a Mary Sue traveling around space and saving the lives of younger girls, it simply wasn't Kuroneko's cup of tea. Despite its problems, Kirino gets an offer to have her novel officially published, but Kirino isn't interested in My Star anymore. Instead, she wants to rewrite the same story in a different setting, changing the name to My City. How original. In order to help her write it, she recruits Kyosuke to go around Akiba with her and reenact various scenes like walking into the middle of the street and getting run over, and buying her a 30,000 yen ring. It doesn't take long to determine that this expedition is actually a date in Kirino's eyes, although telling your brother to die on Christmas Eve doesn't sound like the most romantic thing. Anyways, January rolls around, and within the space of a month, not only has My City been finished, but it's become a bestseller and is getting an anime adaptation. Naturally, Kirino goes to meet the producers of the adaptation along with Sayori and Kuroneko, and it doesn't take long for her to demonstrate just how out of depth she is. She already has a list of voice actors picked out, a specific artist for the character design, as well as requesting a different opening and ending for every episode. She's clearly ecstatic, but it doesn't take long for her mood to drop as the producers explain that that's simply not how anime adaptation works. For starters, the voice actors have their own lives, and the anime is scheduled to start airing in about half a year, so they're already strapped for time, but even more important is the lack of source material. Kirino has only written one novel, which is only enough for 3 or 5 episodes, even if you stretch it. To put it bluntly, My City simply isn't cut out for anime adaptation. This is the stage that Oreimo sets up for the ensuing conversations, and it has 3 main aspects. The first is the author's perspective. Kirino is giddy with the opportunity to show her creative work to tens of thousands of fans, and filled to the brim with ideas of what that might look like. This directly contests the second aspect, which is the perspective of the anime studio. They know how to create anime, what parts don't adapt well, etc., etc. And some sort of balance between the adapter's wisdom and the creator's passion needs to be achieved, which is where the third aspect comes in, that being that this setup is intrinsically flawed. Oreimo does not intend to give a proper representation of the industry, and that intention is clear as day. The anime studio had a falling out with their last project, leading to a last-minute cancellation, so now they're trying to strap together something to fill the time slot. And what better way to do that than to get a middle school, attention-seeking girl who suddenly made it big? Is this the best solution? No, they could just air a rerun of something else, but for the purposes of discussing the anime industry, it isn't entirely their fault either. It's simply a failure of the system, and at the end of the day, Kirino doesn't have to accept either. But Oreimo ignores this, and instead it frames the producers as predators. With that made clear, back to the narration. Producer C asks Kirino why the protagonist is female, and Kuroneko wastes no time in pointing out that they're Mary Sue, which isn't great, so producer C asks if they can change that, but such a thought is so incomprehensible to Kirino that she gets sick. Soon afterwards, Kyosuke contacts Sayori and Kuroneko to find out what is the cause, and is quickly informed of the rushed quality of the adaptation. With that, he decides to attend the second production meeting in Kirino's place because of some vague feeling that pisses him off. The producers immediately start where they left off, that being figuring out what to do about the protagonist being a girl, their discussion going as follows. The novel's audience is by majority male, so making the anime's protagonist a guy would increase their immersion, as well as make for a better dynamic between the protagonist and the young girls they save. So I guess they've never heard of Yuri, but producer D does suggest that they keep the protagonist the same in order to ride the same wave that the novel had already established. That being said, there are some scenes that when brought over to film simply won't make sense anymore, like when the scrawny hero lifts a pile of rubble, so with that in mind, it might be better to treat the anime as its own original work that takes place nearby while tying back into the source material as much as possible. That keeps the protagonist female and gives enough content for 13 episodes while still including the source material when possible. Kyosuke, however, thinks that doing so would make the use of Kirino's novel pretty much irrelevant, but as producer C explains, there isn't really a lot they can do with so little source material. Additionally, they're running a business, and at the end of the day, their number one priority is to turn a profit. profit. Sure, they can do the strictest adaptation possible, but such a product in this scenario would be stale and more likely than not insulting to the creator. As such, they're exploring ideas to create the best adaptation given the circumstances for a mutual benefit. That being as it is, he reminds Kyosuke that as the stand-in for the author, he is free to cancel if he wants to. Kyosuke hesitates, giving room for Kuroneko to throw in her 2 cents, accusing producer C of sabotaging the adaptation. See what I mean? The producers explained very clearly that they were making these decisions with all parties' priorities in mind, but with a snap of the fingers, none of that matters. Producer C goes from calmly decisive to suddenly guilty, leaving Oreimo free to say pretty much whatever it wants. Kuroneko's argument is that no studio should have picked up a project like Kirino's novel in the first place, which is true, but it ignores Kirino's complicit responsibility for accepting that invitation, which is like half of the argument here, but that's just being ignored because Oreimo doesn't want to deal with it. Instead, what it wants to deal with is developing a relationship between Kyosuke and Kirino. A moment of silence follows as Kyosuke thinks to himself. He hates Kirino, but he also hates that she's being taken advantage of, and so as a sibling, he has to help her out. He turns to the producers, gets on his knees, and begs. He asks them to show their chops as professionals and make the adaptation according to Kirino's desires, ignoring the fact that doing so would most likely discredit her career. And they do. Eventually, the anime airs, ironically with nothing said of how it performs. Now, I don't think it's hard to see that Oreimo has established a pattern at this point. In part 1, it brought up a big question and then failed to answer it because it contrived the nature of its argument, and it's done the same thing here, not only in that Kirino accepted the anime adaptation in the first place, but also that she never bothered to drop out when it was clearly going down the wrong path, just so that Oreimo could make a point about how the anime studio should give up all of its creative rights to the author so they can do whatever they want with it, even if they don't know how to make anime. I guess it's confusing, but the pattern is there. All these arguments are just being contrived away from what they were originally set up to do so that Oreimo can do whatever it wants with them, and that's going to cause a lot of problems down the line. Currently, Oreimo just finished episode 8, but traveling back to episode 6, Kyosuke is spending the day at Monami's. In terms of comedy, this episode is one of the best, but for my purposes, all that's really important to note is that Kyosuke finds Monami's house to be more relaxing than his own, and that if somebody confessed feelings for him, he would turn them down because that would be too much trouble for him. Fast forward to episode 11, and Monami is now at Kyosuke's house to make dinner while their parents are out. Kirino thinks that Monami is actually over to have and in order to remove that misunderstanding, Monami offers to clean the living room. Of course, that's not the whole story. The two girls also have a long-standing beef with each other, and Monami wants to make up for it in some way, even though she isn't the responsible party. So Monami, like Kyosuke, is basing her decisions around resolving conflict and is perfectly plain, therefore making her the perfect match for Kyosuke. And that returns us to questioning Kyosuke's character. Last time I said that it felt like he was contrived, but now I have more information to give a definitive answer, and to help in doing so, I'm going to compare Kyosuke to the protagonist of Hyoka, Hotaro Oreki. The two of them are remarkably similar. While Oreki is more focused on conserving energy and Kyosuke more focused on blending in with the crowd, their ideologies on why they need to do something are nearly identical in practice. They also both have a female companion, Chitanda and Kirino respectively, that gets in their way from living in line with such an ideology, and by the end of their stories, they've changed to become a different person. So then, what's the difference? Consistency. Here's a graph of Oreki's character arc, and here's a graph of Kyosuke's character arc. Oreki's arc is gradual and subtle. At a glance, the change seems sudden because of this, but in hindsight, the reasons and signs that a change was happening are easily identifiable and consistent with each other. And then we have Kyosuke. In episodes 1 through 3, he works to avoid conflict, but then in episodes 4 and 5 he's suddenly throwing himself into conflicts that have nothing to do with him. In episode 6, he suddenly wants a peaceful life again, only to then be helping Kirino again in episode 8. Not only is he just suddenly swapping behavior between episodes, the reasons for that are unrelated to the previous events. Kyosuke says he wants one thing, only for nearly all of his actions to contradict it. After the first act, he becomes the main character, helps everyone else trope that you find in anime like Hyoka, Clannad, Snafu, and I could go on for hours listing more, but the point is that Kyosuke doesn't stick to the reason he had for being in that trope. He's just introduced to it and then never given more support for why he's still in that role. It's like a romance anime where the protagonists fall in love for no more reason than that it's a romance. So with all that said, yeah, I think Kyosuke is a contrived character, which is a problem, but especially so because he's the main character. Since he's contrived, he now exists purely to satisfy the plot's desire, and since that desire concerns him directly, it will feel empty and unearned. Wrapping up the episode, Kirino gets out Kyosuke's and Monomi finds them, which stresses Kyosuke out, so to cheer him up, Sayori organizes a party. Therein, Kyosuke says that he's been down because rather than being condescending, Monomi has been nice to him, but that weird feeling is wrong for them. I have no idea what Kyosuke is trying to say with this, since that's kind of what their relationship has been this entire time, so there's not really any weird feeling in the first place, so it feels like he's just making stuff up at this point. Anyways, as an apology for her deed and as thanks for Kyosuke's help, Kirino gives him one of her eroge, end scene. Oreimo Season 1, much like a visual novel, has multiple endings, and while that's cute, it also causes problems. But why did it have multiple endings in the first place? I don't know, but my best guess is that episode 12 rolled around and everyone realized that they needed an ending, so they made one. The problem then became that when more content was approved, the only solution was to make a different ending, which started by mostly repeating the first ending. And the similarities between those episodes are negligent, but the differences are not. For the first ending, Kirino announces that she has something she wants to show Kyosuke, and then pulls out a box from her closet. Kyosuke panics over what he might be forced to see, but agrees regardless. Kirino immediately changes her mind, but Kyosuke eventually reveals an airplane ticket to America. This is immediately followed by a heartfelt conversation where Kyosuke tells Kirino to take the opportunity and leave. There are various signs throughout the scene, like Kirino's hesitation before she says she hates Kyosuke in the context of the eroge they had played where the heroine leaves to go overseas, that indicate that Kirino wants Kyosuke to stop her. He doesn't, but in the end that doesn't matter because she chooses not to go anyways. And as for the second, or true ending, Kyosuke decides not to see what Kirino wants to show him, so instead Kirino pulls out her track medals, saying that sometimes they cheer her up when she's down, and the episode ends with Kirino having disappeared to America. Individually, I have no problem with these endings. To me, it's been clear that Kirino has been getting unusually close to her brother, so her desire to stay in Japan makes sense, but that doesn't mean she has to either. After all, it's a hasty transition, and given that Kirino has been saving up for this trip for nearly half a year, it doesn't make sense for her to suddenly decide not to go. What I do have a problem with is that both of these episodes exist. When put back to back, the difference is so glaring that the Kirino in ending 1 feels like a different character than the one in ending 2. For the first ending, Kirino is willing to go to any length to stay with Kyosuke because as much as she wants to pursue track, she can't bear to be away from the person she's been chasing for 12 episodes. But in episode 2, that aspect is completely absent, and when put in that light, it implies that Kirino doesn't actually want to be with Kyosuke, which is kind of misleading based off of what I've seen so far. All that said, this isn't really a fault of Oreimo itself as much as it is just an unfortunate aspect of the adaptation. The first ending isn't part of the original novels, and given that, I think that Oreimo would be better without the first ending. But it has 2 endings, so I have to mention it, just like how I'm going to mention that the anime adaptation arc also wasn't in the original novels, which recontextualizes it in a weird way. Nevertheless, the true ending isn't over. Kirino is now in America, but by the time season 2 starts, she's back in Japan, so what happens in the time before that? To begin, the new school year started. Kuroneko is attending Kyosuke's high school, and with Kirino gone, Kyosuke couldn't be happier with how quiet his life is. Or at least that's what he says. Instead, he gets Kuroneko to join the game creation club and helps her work with her partner developer who doesn't like that Kuroneko's game was chosen over hers. Kuroneko, who has always preferred to work alone, gets pissed that Kyosuke keeps sticking his nose in her business, but especially so because she thinks he's only doing it to use her as a replacement for Kirino. And that is partially true. Kyosuke has spent the last year dealing with Kirino, and now that she's gone, he's realized that he suddenly has more free time than ever. But he also realized that he doesn't have any friends and that it might be good to try and get some. Kyosuke explains this to Kuroneko and apologizes for his intrusive behavior. She accepts that apology and thanks him for his help regardless, telling him that she likes him just as much as Kirino. And that's not a surprise. That element of the story has been building for some time, I just haven't really mentioned it until now. For a short moment, everything is fine in Kyosuke's life until he gets 2 texts. The first is from Kuroneko telling him to meet behind the school, and the second is from Kirino telling him to destroy her entire collection. Shocked, especially given that Kyosuke hasn't heard from his sister in 3 months, he calls Ayase to see if she knows what's up. She's blocked his number, so Kyosuke has to use Monomi's phone, but Ayase doesn't know anything anyways. And so Kyosuke goes to meet Kuroneko, and upon seeing his distress, she puts off her plans to instead hear him out. Once caught up, she tells Kyosuke to go to America and find out what's going on for himself, but not before she gives him a kiss, which she calls a curse that won't be lifted until he fulfills her wish. And boom, he's in America. In short, Kirino wanted to prove to herself how good she was at track, deciding that she wouldn't talk to anyone in Japan until she had beaten one of her athletes in a time trial, but since she had failed to do so after just 1/4 of her stay, she had given up, and as punishment for her failure, she wanted everything she owned to be destroyed. After some thinking, Kyosuke lays down an ultimatum and tells Kirino that she is going back to Japan with him, but she complains, saying that track means a lot to her and that it would be stupid to give up after just 3 months. Yes, I'm being serious, this is actually what happens. Kyosuke says he doesn't care about Kirino's problems, wants her to come back because he's lonely and can't go on living without her. And so Kirino goes to beat her roommate in a rigged race and returns to Japan. With that, Season 1 officially ends, leaving in its wake the wreckage caused by two problems: its inability to make cohesive arguments and the contrived nature of its main character. The question raised in Part 1 seems to have been all but forgotten, and the same seems to have happened to the problem with Ayase. Part of the content that I skipped is that Ayase asked Kyosuke to help her pick out a gift for Kirino's birthday. Yes, Ayase asking for help from the person she hates the most about her best friend. And of course, Kyosuke helps her because he has to, but only because the plot said so and not because he actually had a real reason. But it gets worse. Season 1 at the very least brought up important aspects of living as an otaku in Japan, but Season 2 quickly drops that integral facet of the story to instead focus on romance while carrying all the problems from Season 1 along with it. It gets so bad that in order to mentally prepare yourself, I recommend you take a break. To say that Oreimo Season 2 gets off to a rough start would be an understatement. Episode 1 consists entirely of Kirino buying anime merch, Episode 2 is an over-elongated excuse to say that dating sims aren't realistic, Episode 3 is the backstory of Sayori, a character that I haven't mentioned in quite a long time, and Episode 4 is filler with nothing worth even going over. It's not a great look, but once Season 2 does finally get on its feet, Kirino recruits Kyosuke to pretend to be her boyfriend so that she can get out of becoming Eternal Blue's exclusive model. In order to do so, they have to actually pretend to go on a date together because they're under the irrational belief that the hiring agent is stalking them. So, they wander around Japan and manage to run into every plot-relevant character, all of whom believe that Kirino and Kyosuke are actually dating. Nevertheless, Kirino isn't very happy with how the date went and tells Kyosuke that next time she needs to get out of a lucrative business opportunity, she'll just ask her real boyfriend. The next day, Kyosuke explains to Kuroneko that the date was fake and asks her if Kirino actually has a boyfriend. Kuroneko isn't certain if the mysterious boyfriend exists, but if he did, it would make her very happy. After all, that would mean Kirino would stay further away from Kyosuke, leaving more room in the love triangle for Kuroneko. And indeed, midway through Summer Comiket, the boyfriend Makagami appears. Not that Kyosuke or anyone else can tell that this is Kirino's boyfriend, despite how obvious that is. Less obvious is the fact that Kirino doesn't really like Makagami and she's just probing Kyosuke for his reaction. Would you look at that? Some proper foreshadowing. In other news, Kuroneko managed to sell out her stock of dojins, and so the group is going to throw a party in her favor. On the way over, Kyosuke attempts to confront Kuroneko about when she kissed him, but before she can give a response that a terminally dense harem protagonist could understand, Kirino interrupts, yelling at the two to get inside so that the festivities could begin. They don't begin because Kirino immediately crashes the party by announcing to the surprise of everybody that Makagami is her boyfriend. Kuroneko leaves, obviously upset that Kirino decided to make such an announcement at such an inopportune time, and Kyosuke asks Kirino what she was trying to do with such a stunt. So Kirino asks what Kyosuke wanted her to do. I don't know, at least try to be civilized? Kyosuke isn't concerned with what Kirino does, saying she should make her own decisions without Kyosuke telling her what to do. And that contradicts pretty much everything Kyosuke has done so far, but it goes without saying that he goes back on this discrepancy in record time anyways. A number of days pass, and on the 17th, Kyosuke finds that Makagami has come to the Kosaka household to give an offering of cake. Kyosuke rudely kicks Makagami out of his seat, upsetting Kirino, who slaps him, and so he stalks off to trigger a flashback. While cleaning up the party some days ago, Sayori tells Kyosuke that she can't really do anything about the recent disruption in the friend group, so she is leaving it up to Kyosuke to solve, and tells him to have some confidence. Somehow, Kyosuke decides that this means that he needs to get Kirino and Makagami to break up, and so returning downstairs, Kyosuke declares that when he said Kirino's life choices were none of his business, he was lying. In fact, he hates the idea of some dude showing up to take away his little sister. It's up to Kirino who she dates, but it upsets Kyosuke that she dates anyone, and so he wants her to break up. And as for what Kyosuke thinks about Makagami, well, he doesn't care how much Makagami cares for Kirino because he won't let anyone date her unless they prove their worth to him by demonstrating that they care for Kirino more than he does, which they can't because Kyosuke loves Kirino. With that said, Makagami drops the ball, finally revealing that Kyosuke has been duped. Makagami was never going out with Kirino, and in fact the entire affair was a ploy to, well, Makagami thinks it was to get Kyosuke to notice Kirino, and Kirino denies this, saying that instead she did it. Well, she doesn't say why, but Kyosuke claims to understand, so we can just move on. With that resolved, Kyosuke meets Kuroneko behind the school again. Kirino has made up with her, but more importantly, she's called him there in order to tell him about the curse. The only solution is to override the curse with a stronger one. Wait, I thought it was removed by fulfilling a wish. In any case, Kuroneko asks Kyosuke out. Kyosuke, however, doesn't seem too inclined to accept that proposal due to being conflicted over his feelings for Kirino. So with that on hiatus, he returns home, and Kirino instantly puts him on the spot concerning his behavior towards Makagami, and while Kyosuke Kyosuke apologizes for his brashness, he still sticks to what he said. Although to make up for it, he does agree that he'll do any one thing that Kirino asks him to do, and Kirino redeems this faster than I use my free daily roll for Scotty Alter, immediately telling Kyosuke that if a girl tells him he loves him in the near future, then he should consider their confession very carefully. Then the whole gang's back together to reattempt the Summer Comiket celebration party. It's still the 17th, in case you were wondering. Other than Kyosuke showing Kirino that he's changed his wallpaper to her in a bikini, everything goes well. Or so it would seem. If you happen to care about when anything is happening in Oreimo, then you will eventually come across this calendar, and then you will learn that Oreimo has tampered with the timeline. In reality, Kuroneko confessed to Kyosuke before he confronted Makagami and Kirino. I think Oreimo may have chugged bone-hurting juice. Somehow it manages to break everything. Let's start at the beginning with Sayori's request. What she's asking Kyosuke to do is intentionally vague, so it's up in the air as to what she's asking, but at the very least she wants Kirino and Kuroneko to stop fighting, but she can't help Kirino and Kuroneko reconcile. Why? She just can't, but for some reason Kyosuke can by getting Makagami and Kirino to break up, except that such reasoning only makes sense because the flashback precedes that scene. But it doesn't actually happen until 4 days later, and after 2 days, Kirino and Kuroneko have made up, which is another problem. Kyosuke doesn't accept Kuroneko's confession because he's conflicted, but over what? This doesn't immediately follow him yelling about how much he loves Kirino, and while that doesn't mean he isn't conflicted between the two, it seems odd that he would then agree to date Kuroneko just hours after choosing Kirino. Any way you slice it, it's just messed up, and not only does this narrative not make sense at all, but Oreimo tries to hide it. The only way that anyone would know that these scenes happened out of order was if they noticed the calendar, which doesn't show up until 2.5 episodes after all of this is concluded. By then, another arc has come and gone, and it's too late to change anything. Now, even with the tampering, Kyosuke probably only dates Kuroneko because of Kirino's request to rethink the confession. But when did Kirino find out that Kuroneko is going to confess to Kyosuke? Well, let's find out.
Do the impossible, see the invisible. Bro, fight the power.
Kuroneko and Kyosuke have started dating, but Kuroneko wants to make sure that the relationship goes more than smoothly. In order to do so, she creates the Destiny Record, a meticulously crafted guide detailing every step along the way to her eventual goal of having Kyosuke end up with Kirino. Wait, what? That can't be right. Oreimo has made it very clear that Kuroneko likes Kyosuke, and her naturally contentious relationship with Kirino lends itself to having the two of them compete over Kyosuke, so then why does Kuroneko want this? My best guess is that Kuroneko has foreseen such a development, and in order to stop it, she needs to warn Kyosuke and stop him from going any further. However, for such a theory to be validated, it also needs the execution to be solid. And that simply isn't. For starters, why doesn't she just tell Kyosuke that incest is bad rather than relying on the cryptic Destiny Record and telling him that she wants Kyosuke to be with Kirino? Then again, maybe Kuroneko is waiting for more pieces of the puzzle to fall into place so that she can strike a decisive blow. The pair spend some time together, visit each other's houses, go to the pool, and on the last day of summer vacation, they watch the fireworks, and Kuroneko breaks up with Kyosuke. As it turns out, Kuroneko's family moved due to her father's job, and she even had to transfer school, so now that she's gone, Kyosuke enters a depressive funk. In order to get him out of it, Kirino gets Kuroneko to tell her where she is, and Kuroneko complies, sending a map of the area. Kirino and Kuroneko then engage in a heated battle called Conversation, from which we learn the following. Kirino pretended to date Makagami to make sure that Kyosuke viewed her as his number one, which surprises Kyosuke, so we must have thought that she did it for who knows why. I can't think of the slightest reason of why he thought he understood what she was doing, but despite hearing everything she wanted from Kyosuke about how he wouldn't let her date anyone, she doesn't feel like she has the same right to do the same for Kyosuke. So when Kuroneko asked her for permission to date her brother, she approved even if she didn't like it. With that, Kuroneko asks Kyosuke what he will do. Will he restart the relationship with her, or will he favor Kirino's feelings? And Kyosuke considers carefully before he says nothing. Kuroneko interrupts him, saying that if he answers her question, she will die. Why are you like this? I can't think of a more opportune time for Kuroneko to pull the rug than this moment. So did she not have a rug to pull, or did she chicken out? I doubt the latter to be the case, since Kuroneko has already gone to the lengths to dump Kyosuke and also said this.
私にとって同人は自己満足趣味 100% を叩きつける場なの。オナニー作品がつまらないというのなら超すごいオナニーを見せつけてやるだけのことよ。
But then why do this? Or rather, who does Kuroneko want Kyosuke to choose? I would love to say Kuroneko, but I can't justify that as being the case. Kuroneko has always been in conflict with Kirino, be it over tastes in anime or the pursuit of Kyosuke, but now all of a sudden she feels like Ayase. She isn't interested in Kyosuke, she wants Kirino to be happy at any cost, and so she becomes a catalyst to achieve that. In a later episode, she even gets into an argument with Ayase over who is a better friend for Kirino, going so far as to say that she would be happy if Kirino committed incest. And the reason for all these actions is, surprise, Kuroneko is a contrived character. Wrapping this up, Kyosuke does tell Kirino that his choice was to drop the matter with Kuroneko so that Kirino wouldn't have to suffer, but only for as long as Kirino doesn't have a boyfriend. And this puts them in a catch-22, but only because they actually think that being siblings is grounds to deny each other's relationships. Kyosuke is now living alone with Ayase. Now, how in the world did that happen? Well, Kyosuke's parents finally noticed that the siblings were suddenly rather close, and that's a problem because Kyosuke has to take the Tokyo University exam in 1 month and Kirino would distract him from studying. As such, he's being exiled to an apartment and he can only return if he gets an A on the test. Kyosuke, of course, welcomes this change because he can finally live the peaceful mundane life away from Kirino that he's always wanted. Or at least that's what he tells Monami. She doesn't buy it, and so she suggests that they throw a housewarming party, but in order to do so, she needs to invite people. She chooses to invite Sayori, Kuroneko, and Ayase. Ayase gets invited because Monami wants to make up with Kirino because they have a beef about something. Since Monami can't invite Kirino, Ayase offers to invite her and then breaks into Kyosuke's apartment to inform him of the plans. Kyosuke is elated that Ayase is being invited, but depressed that Kirino is going to be invited, and so logically, Kyosuke then invites Kirino. Everyone shows up, and eventually some irrelevant gremlin says that it's rude for Kyosuke to eat food made by another girl. Take note that Kyosuke is the only male at this party. This immediately snowballs as the Harambe. Anyways, they begin to argue over who should take over Kyosuke because heaven forbid he should become self-dependent, eventually deciding via Kirino's command that Ayase do the job because she hates Kyosuke. Ayase doesn't deny this fact, and so the two begin to spend more time together. Then one day, as Ayase leaves Kyosuke's apartment, it is revealed that she has a stalker. But this plot point goes nowhere. It gets dropped faster than it dropped out of Calculus 3, and as such I question why it was even included at all. But going back to the important matter of this arc, late one night, Ayase has a confession. For the last 15 months, she's been lying. Ever since Kyosuke first declared himself to be a syscon, she knew that Kyosuke was lying. He wasn't actually a syscon, but even though Ayase knew this, she physically harmed Kyosuke, blocked his number, lied to Kirino's face, and despite disliking lies so much, never bothered to apologize to Kyosuke because, well, would you look at that, she never gives a reason. There has been some foreshadowing that Ayase kept asking Kyosuke for help with her best friend, but even then, there is the elephant in the room. If Ayase always knew that Kyosuke was lying, then she also always knew that Kirino liked the deplorable syscon bait that Ayase claims to hate. Was that a lie? From the character that hates lies? Well, I can't think of another reason that explains why Ayase decides to ignore that aspect of Kirino, so I guess it must be. In the end, it doesn't matter how you look at it. Ayase is a contrived character that is only existing to further the incest. Kyosuke passes his exam, of course, and when he leaves his apartment, he meets Ayase. She says that he's everything she hates, a syscon, a liar, a degenerate, but he's nice, and so she's fallen in love with him. Obviously, Kyosuke turns her down because he loves Kirino, and I think that Oreimo may have finally broken me. What if I told you that I could fix everything? Would you believe me if I told you that I could make everything in Oreimo make sense? Would you believe me if I said that a long time ago Kirino was a shy child who looked up to her confident brother? To her, Kyosuke was nothing short of the best, athletic, popular, and smart, but Kyosuke was never too concerned for Kirino, and so as he grew up, he left her behind. Years passed, and before Kirino knew it, Kyosuke had become normal. But how could he do that? Kirino looked up to him, and he had the gall to become normal? She went to Monami, asking for the old Kyosuke back, but Monami refused. After all, the old Kyosuke had never existed. Kirino didn't believe this, meaning that she only had one thing to do: show him up, become better than Kyosuke, and rub it in his face. So, she joined track, became an honor student, and a model. More time passed, and eventually Kirino realized that Monami was right. Kyosuke wasn't special, Kirino just hadn't met enough people that were normal. But there was another thing that Monami was right about. Incest is gross, but Kirino couldn't let this go. She became the person she was for Kyosuke, and never having her feelings reciprocated just wouldn't do. She began thinking of ways to get Kyosuke to love her back, and then she discovered eroge. At last, she had a guide, hundreds of games where the heroine falls in love with the older brother, and vice versa. All she had to do was take their advice nice, and eventually Kyosuke would inevitably fall in love with her, and so Kirino hatched her plan. Get Kyosuke to find your eroge, get him to play your eroge, have him meet your lackeys, have him fight for you, fake a falling out with your best friend, wait for the subconscious effect of the eroge to slowly infiltrate his mind while spending more time with him than ever before, and then suddenly move to America. After 3 months, send a shocking message and get Kuroneko to convince Kyosuke to go to America while also planting the seeds for the next phase. Get a boyfriend, have Kyosuke break you up, and then have Kuroneko start dating Kyosuke so that you can break them up in turn. Just to double check, do the same with Ayase, and then wait for everything to come to fruition. And I'd have to say it worked. On Christmas Eve, Kyosuke takes Kirino out to Akiba, where he then confesses to her in public. To nobody's surprise, she turns him down, saying that incest is gross, and so Kyosuke tells her to marry him, and she accepts. Kyosuke slips the 30,000 yen ring that Kirino told him to buy a year ago onto her finger, and they make a promise. So, what do you think? I solved every problem. The story is fixed. It has no problems. I've wasted my time. Oreimo is actually great! Stories here. While Lab's theory is fun and all, at the end of the day it's just filling in plot holes with no support. Oreimo never confirms that Kirino planned all of this, and the theory itself has one very critical flaw. Kirino isn't a tsundere. Kirino loves her eroge because she views the games as guides to getting Kyosuke to love her, but she never changes herself to act like the heroines of those games. If she had, then her role as a tsundere would be very clear, going from berating Kyosuke to loving him, but that simply doesn't happen. It doesn't happen because Kirino is a narcissist. According to Kirino, if you haven't watched Stardust Witch Merudu, then you haven't lived, and if you don't like it, you're wrong. Kirino has to be good at track, and when she fails to live up to that, her mental state deteriorates rapidly. She spends her days without Kyosuke kicking his door, and her best friend lives for nothing more than to validate her. Kirino is rarely nice to Kyosuke, or even her friends, belittling them constantly. She even gives him one of her eroge as an apology for showing Monami his Kirino doesn't love Kyosuke, and she doesn't want to fall in love with Kyosuke. She just wants him to like her, just like how she wants everyone else to like her. One thing that I also skipped that happened around the time of Kyosuke's confession was his final breakup with Kuroneko. Up to that point, Kyosuke had shown every intention of reuniting with Kuroneko once everything had blown over, but in the end he chose his sister. As such, the two meet up one night, and upon hearing his decision, she tears apart the Destiny record and makes a declaration. Her wish is fulfilled, the curse is lifted, and for breaking her heart, she swears revenge. I feel like this was an attempt at a nuanced character, but Kuroneko's dilemma is whether she wants Kyosuke to fall in love with her or his sister. Not to say that such a setup can't be nuanced, but all of Kuroneko's critical decisions are to get Kyosuke together with Kirino without giving any reasons as to why that would be better than choosing Kuroneko. And then there is her revenge, which consists of recording Kyosuke turning her down because he's a syscon, and then blasting the recording on speakers during his confession to Kirino. Anyways, that's how Kuroneko's arc ends, and I'm tired of thinking about the show more than I need to, so let's just get this wrapped up. Kyosuke and Kuroneko have graduated, and as they walk beneath the cherry blossoms, they encounter Monami. As per the two girls' agreement, Monami is there to fight, directly leading to the best frame in Oreimo. Finally, somebody did it, and having the best girl Monami deliver the blow has raised my battery to negative 10%. After the two calm down from their catfight, Monami turns to lecture the siblings on their terrible decision. If they continue down the path they're on, then they will only hurt more people, and in the end, the ones that they hurt the most will be themselves. After all, they only just started, but cracks have already appeared. Kyosuke regrets having to turn down Ayase and Kuroneko, and Kirino, much like when she first discovered eroge, is hesitant to be publicly proud of her relationship. It's not hard to see that Oreimo is saying that incest is the same thing as being an otaku. That didn't come out right. Okay, all the way back in part 1, the question of what to do about being an adult otaku was asked, and all the same problems that applied to that also applied to incest. Monami just asked the question again, and now after 28 episodes, Kyosuke finally has the opportunity to give his answer. Which is, who cares, you're right and we're wrong, society is great and all, but if it doesn't agree with me, then I don't much care for it anymore because my love for what they hate is more important. Bruh. I get that Oreimo was trying, no, maybe trying is too strong. I can see the clear parallel between otaku culture and incest, but up to this moment that concept has not been part of the story. The same can be said for the question of what to do about it because that question was raised a long time ago and hasn't been brought up since. So from a critical perspective, this is a failure, but on the other hand it is somewhat fitting. Kyosuke and Kirino have spent all of Oreimo running from this question, and when finally forced to confront it, Kyosuke says he'll just keep running. And I would say that's acceptable somewhat if Oreimo had any intention of supporting that idea, but it doesn't. Instead, Monami fails to give the siblings to stop, her friendship with Kyosuke forever fractured, and the two of them get married. And then they break up. Turns out that promise they made on Christmas Eve was to date each other until they graduated and then return to being normal siblings. Because of course they know they can't realistically have such a relationship, meaning that Oreimo's ultimate answer to the big question is that you will be forced to stop being an otaku. Not that you'll grow out of it or find a way to balance it in your life, but that if you want to have any hope of making it in the modern day, you will simply just have to stop being an otaku. That is a very strange message for a series that has spent its runtime exploring why the culture is so fascinating to end on. I don't think it's the message that it intended to end with, but given that Oreimo has always struggled to make the argument it wanted, it is only fitting that when it mattered most, it failed to change fate in its favor. So, what do I think about Oreimo? In all honesty, I've been nothing but negative about it for nearly an hour, but that's not to say it was all bad. For one, Oreimo is a comedy and most of the time that was executed quite well. The animation isn't anything special, but it isn't glaringly bad either. In fact, there's a wide number of minutiae that I could have brought up, but just didn't really feel like I had a relevant excuse to talk about them. For example, Kuroneko keeps wearing the same dress because it's the one that Kyosuke complimented her on once, going so far as to transform it into the dress that she wears when they start dating. Not that I'm sure where the extra frills went when she came back from the shower in this scene, but oh wait, is that actually an error? I could also talk about the soundtrack and the sound design, but given that my taste in music sounds like those two having a car accident, I will excuse myself from having to do that. But all that said, does that make Oreimo good?
No way. Not this time. No.
A meal is more than a nice drink, and the meat and the potatoes of this meal are giving off a poisonous cloud. At the end of the day, you have to consider the presentation and when all the factors come together, and when that happens for Oreimo, it just doesn't work out. Nearly every character is contrived. By the end of the story, everyone else is trying to get Kyosuke and Kirino together while saying how much they want that not to happen. Most of the time, the plot just does whatever it wants, and more often than not, the reasons for why come out of left field. And when the story drags on and on with so many basic story threads just not coming together, even comedy can't save it. The only way to enjoy Oreimo is to turn off your brain and ignore what's actually happening, but at that point, why even watch it? Oreimo is a disaster, and I have nothing more to say about it. Thank you for listening to some nobody on YouTube rant. Now go and get a slice of your own life.